Welcome to the Center for Strategic and International Studies. We're going to look at the Russian performance on the battlefield in Ukraine. My name is Seth Jones, the president of the Defense and Security Department at CSIS.
I'm Riley McCabe, an associate fellow with the Warfare, Irregular Threats, and Terrorism program here at CSIS.
So thanks for joining us. There have been a range of different views on how the Russians are doing in Ukraine. So for some, the Russians hold all the cards. They have advantages in numbers of soldiers, but also in those that can be mobilized. They also have some advantages in their industrial base, particularly when you include the assistance that the Russians have received from China, including components, Iran, that's a range of different weapon systems, including drones, and then the North Koreans, who have provided soldiers a range of artillery, missiles, and a number of other different types of assistance. There are others who've argued that actually the Russians haven't done as effective a job as many had thought. So we're going to look more seriously at this. And the two questions that are driving this are really, one is, how are the Russians performing on the battlefield in Ukraine? And second is, what factors are contributing to that? What we'll show you is sort of four big indicators of Russian performance. One is Russian rates of advance, and as we'll show you, Riley will walk you through this, the Russians have actually performed historically slowly on their average rates of advance, which really shows you how difficult the Russians have had in maneuver warfare. The second item is we'll look at the territory that the Russians have gained or conquered in the last 16 to 17 months. And what we'll show you there is that it's actually been tiny, less than 1% of Ukrainian territory, despite over a year and a half of warfare, which is really poor performance. We'll look at the third, we'll look at the rate of equipment destroyed compared to the Ukrainians, and actually show you that the Russians have lost a lot, including in comparison to the Ukrainians. And fourth, we'll look at the casualty and fatality rates of the Russians with this sort of big finding that the Russians have essentially reached the 1 million casualty mark of the war since the full-scale invasion began in February of 2022, which is stunningly large compared to all Russian and Soviet wars since World War II. So that's where we'll go. Let's start with the Russian way of war, because I think it's important to put this into context. How are the Russians fighting? Well, they may have hoped at the beginning of this war to be able to move quickly and take the capital, Kyiv, in something that looked like the U.S. Operation Desert Storm, sort of the quick move against Iraqi forces in 1990 and 1991, but that clearly did not happen. They've moved into attrition war. And as we see here on the map, the Russians are pushing forward on several fronts. If you could see the arrows around Kupiansk and down here around Pokrovsk and Avdiivka, we see a Russian line that is pushing forward. At least two elements right now include the sort of Russian way of war. One is the use of dismounted infantry to push along these lines, including with some vehicles. They've got drones, including first-person drones or FPVs. Some of those vehicles include tanks and infantry fighting vehicles and armored personnel carriers. A second major component of the Russian way of warfare is their targeting with missiles, ballistic and cruise missiles, occasionally hypersonics, as well as drones of Ukrainian cities. That's more of a punishment side of the story. What's interesting as we look here is there are a couple of challenges that the Russians have faced which lead to some of the indicators that Riley and I will walk you through on the Russian performance. One is that the way the Russians are fighting using dismounted infantry, trying to take territory with individuals moving forward, whether they're Russian or we've seen in Kursk with North Koreans, it's leading to large numbers of casualties. A second challenge that the Russians have faced is we are seeing a really poor use of fires, particularly artillery, missiles, including cruise missiles, with maneuver on the ground. They're just not synchronized in any way. most of those fires are really targeting Ukrainian cities. So we don't see the fire and maneuver that we would see with a major military force. And then the third, Riley, if you go to the next slide, is the defense that the Ukrainians have set up, which is also causing large numbers of casualties and fatalities. So here's the trench system that the Ukrainians have built. Some of these are unoccupied, but at various stages we've seen plenty of occupied trenches. And if you go to the next slide, we see dragon's teeth. These are essentially pyramid, often concrete structures. As you can see in some of these, they're 2 or 3 lines deep, which make it very difficult for Russian tanks or armored vehicles to move into those areas. They just can't get through those dragon's teeth layers. So this layered defense has been a problem. And so to get to the indicators of how the Russians have performed, we'll turn to Riley.
Thanks, Seth. Yeah, so to assess Russia's battlefield performance, we looked at 4 indicators. The first is Russia's rate of advance. That's how quickly Russian troops are pushing the front line forward. The second we looked at is the territory they've taken as they continue to push forward. And to assess those metrics, I want to highlight 2 Russian campaigns that have happened since January 2024. The first that I want to draw our attention to is down here in Donetsk Oblast. In February 2024, Russian forces captured the city of Avdiivka, and have continued to push westward since then. And what we're seeing is that the Russian troops are moving at about 135 meters per day. And they've captured in that area about 3,000 square kilometers of territory. Further north in Kharkiv Oblast, the Russians have been attempting to encircle the Ukrainian city of Kupiansk since November 2024. And in that offensive, they're moving incredibly slowly at just an average of 50 meters per day. And they've taken fewer than 500 square kilometers in that area. To add some historical context on those figures, I want to draw your attention to this table, which shows us the rates of advance compared to, at the bottom, various offensives in the war in Ukraine since February 2022, compared to some historical offensive campaigns. And what we see, and I'll highlight here at the bottom, Russia's offensive in Kupiansk that I just spoke about, they're moving at nearly half the speed of the infamous Battle of the Somme, where Allied forces pushed forward in a grinding and grueling and costly military offensive in World War I. So in total, what we're seeing is that since January 2024, Russian forces have seized less than 5,000 square kilometers of new Ukrainian territory. That's less than 1% of all Ukrainian territory. It's also an area smaller than the state of Delaware. This decisively falls short of Moscow's objective to greatly expand its control of Ukrainian territory. So that's what Russia has taken, but what has it lost in exchange? Well, we looked at 2 more indicators to measure that. The first is equipment losses, and what we see here is that Russia is losing vast amounts of fighting equipment. I want to highlight a few here on our table. The first is Russia has lost over 1,200 armored fighting vehicles. They've lost almost 2,000 tanks, and they've lost more than 3,200 infantry fighting vehicles. These are losses just since January 2024. But to compare that to Ukraine's losses really gives you a sense of how inefficiently the Russians have been fighting. And that's what this chart here shows us. It's a ratio of Russian equipment losses to Ukrainian equipment losses. And what we see is that consistently from the start of the war till today, Russia has lost 2 to 5 times more equipment than Ukraine, which really emphasizes how inefficiently they've been fighting. For our 4th indicator, which is fatalities and casualties on the battlefield, I'm going to let Seth break that down.
Thanks, Riley. So if we go to the next slide, I think what's important is to take a step back and look at how the Russians have performed in at least in the sense of past Russian and Soviet wars since World War II. And what we found overall is that the Russians have suffered roughly 1 million casualties and somewhere between 200 and 250,000 fatalities. Casualties is both dead and wounded. Fatalities is just killed or missing. So 200, 250,000 killed. How does that compare historically to Russian and Soviet wars since World War II? This is where one starts to see sort of the dramatic difference between what the Russians are suffering in Ukraine with what they've suffered really over the last century or so. And what you see is, as I step back, and you see essentially all Russian and Soviet wars since World War II, is that the Russians have suffered 5 times the number of fatalities in Ukraine since 2022 compared to all Russian and Soviet wars combined since World War II. 5 times killed in a 3-year span compared to a 77-year span since World War II. It's a dramatic difference. And so let's look at some of those numbers just to give us a sense of the comparison. So if we go, for example, to much of the Cold War, we see relatively small numbers. So Riley, if you could circle Algeria here, 1962 to 1964, the Soviets suffered 25 casualties. If you look at the invasion of Czechoslovakia here, 1968, they suffered 96 casualties. Those numbers start to grow up, to increase. If we look at Afghanistan, where the US, the CIA in particular, provides assistance to the Mujahideen, those numbers come up to 14,000 to 16,000 Russian or Soviet killed in action. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Russians try to prevent an independence movement in Chechnya. So we see there what's really an internal struggle, fatalities between 12,000 and 25,000. Hard to gauge those numbers because it's happening inside of Russia, and they hid fatality levels pretty well. But even in those numbers, I mean, we're talking really 14, 15, 16,000 or so. As we get up to Ukraine, we're seeing between 200 and 250,000 dead Russian soldiers. I mean, look at the comparison. As you take a step back, it is astronomical how much the Russians are suffering. Riley, if you go to the next slide, I also want to point out that in every year of this war, the Russians have suffered more casualties. The bottom line is 2022. The next line up is 2023. And you see every year, by month, they're suffering larger numbers, and we stop this around the April time period. But if that trend continues, that we will have every year they're losing more and more soldiers. And so what does this all mean for the United States? I think there are two vulnerabilities that the Russians have that we wanted to highlight. One is the economy. The Russians face labor shortages. They face few real options for economic growth other than the military right now, and real vulnerabilities in, say, oil and gas. So US sanctions, including secondary sanctions, would have a significant impact on the Russian economy. There's bipartisan support in Congress from Republicans and Democrats, including in the Senate, essentially a veto-proof bill that has been put forth by Senator Blumenthal for Connecticut and Graham from South Carolina. In addition, a US decision to provide military assistance over the next several months and even years, munitions, for example, ATACMS, would be very useful to the Ukrainians and continue these casualty levels. Those things would make a difference. So going back to what we started with, some have argued that the Russians hold all the cards here. As I think you've seen, the Russians do not hold all the cards. In fact, the US holds many of the cards, including sanctions and weapons assistance to the Ukraine. The question for us is, will the US use the cards that it has available? Thanks for joining us. We appreciate it.